Hello, today we're speaking with Matt Plant, President and Co-founder at Voltus. Welcome to Podcast Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. I suppose to start with, could you tell us a little bit about Voltus?
Voltus is a distributed energy resources platform. Our job is to help make electric grids modernized, which means they're decarbonized, they're reliable, and they're cost effective. And we do that by bringing to the electric grid resources, typically customers, who reduce their consumption of electricity when the grid needs them to.
What are some examples of those distributed energy resources?
We help monetize resources, everything from a smart thermostat to an electrical vehicle charging station to a wastewater treatment plant to a big industrial factory, a steel mill, for example, a paper mill, for example.
Fascinating. And we can use the term DERs. So just for the audience, DERs are kind of distributed energy resources. We'll probably use that phrase as we go along. And it's basically just the kind of items that Matt just outlined. And I guess kind of going back to the beginning, what drove the initial decision to start Voltus?
My co-founder and I spent 10 years together building Enernoc, which was sort of a version 1.0 in the demand response space. 10 years later, the need for distributed energy resources has grown considerably. The market has grown considerably. You can monetize these resources in many more ways than you could 10 years ago. And so the market was growing at the time when we felt like the competition wasn't doing exactly what we thought they should be doing. So that was the perfect combination to start a business. Growing market and no one taking advantage of it.
And so you already had that kind of existing relationship with your kind of co-founder. You decided this is the big problem to kind of tackle for the next decade or multi-decades. What did the kind of first 6 months, those early days, look like?
We got really lucky. So partly because of the work that we had done in a similar space for a long time, when we hung up our shingle, a week later, we were reached out to by an entity that needed our help. And so right off the bat, we had a $400,000 contract that we did not expect. We said, holy cow.
Very nice.
This is really, really nice. Apart from that, you're hustling. We had spent time with customers making sure that our solution was one that they wanted and needed. But you're hustling. You're doing everything you can to get the business up and running as soon as possible. And we were determined from day one to get to profitability as quickly as possible. I think I used to pay attention to an event called the National Town Meeting on Demand Response. It has since merged with a solar meeting, but it's still held. And this was in 2016 when we started the business. If you looked at all the companies that had presented at the National Town Meeting on Demand Response, 80% of them were no longer in business. So you had these companies with great ideas, but who never found the right business model to allow them to survive, to allow them to actually deliver on what they were trying to deliver on. So from day one, we were very, very determined to make the business model work straight away. And so most of our early efforts were around making sure that we could do that as quickly as possible. And
so those other 80%, what are the number one or number two things that stops people from getting up and running? I know from my own research, having looked in, starting at the early stages of looking at clean energy startup on my own side, can be a very, very difficult industry to break into. The graves of many companies, many startups are kind of strewn about. But it's such a big, massive industry. The opportunities are so large. The shift in energy consumption is so large. So there's lots of dollars there. I guess, how do you think those companies could have kind of pivoted or, made a better chance, had better odds of success?
I think it is paying attention to the business side and creating a long-term, sustainable, competitive advantage that will allow you to be a healthy financial business. And the good of our industry is that there are so many mission-driven people. We're trying to solve climate change, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the challenge of our time. We're trying to solve this big, meaty problem. So the wonderful part about that is that our industry is full of mission-driven people. That doesn't always equate to people who are hardcore capitalists. And Greg and I are hardcore capitalists. We understand that our business won't be able to attract the investment we need unless we create a very financially sound business that's going to make our investors a lot of money.
And so you have on the business side, that kind of core focus. In terms of the product side, what did the earliest version of that product look like, and what are the kind of pivots that you kind of went through to get to where you are now?
I think the question is, can I rephrase your question?
Please.
When this industry first got started, largely as a result of the Northeast blackout of 2003, we were asking commercial and industrial customers to reduce their consumption of electricity in order to prevent the next big blackout. We had a peak demand problem. 15 years later than that, the need for distributed energy resources was entirely different. We're no longer simply preventing blackouts from happening, though that certainly is a part of our business, with whether it's wildfire-driven blackouts in California or ice storm-driven blackouts in Texas or polar vortex-driven blackouts in Michigan. That's still a part of our business. But increasingly, our resources are used by grid operators to balance the grid, having to do with bringing renewables online. And so when that's the case, we're no longer used 1 or 2 times every year to prevent a blackout. Rather, we are called upon dozens and dozens and dozens of times a year to reduce our energy consumption, oftentimes for very quick periods of time, to help balance the grid. When a power plant, both thermal and renewable, trip offline. And so in connection with that change, you need to move the industry from largely manual-based, asking people to shut things down, to a much more automated process where we are paid to quickly bring resources offline to keep the grid balanced. And so now we saw these changes coming and invested in day one in a lot of product. There hadn't been a company in the space where product was the competitive advantage. Previous, I think, to Voltus, it was largely marketing and sales and sometimes first mover advantage. That created a competitive advantage. But we said, look, when we want to think long term and here's what is coming down the road, here's what we're going to actually get paid for, product needs to be the competitive advantage.
And so that product, that's just how is your product, that kind of next step on, particularly in the kind of demand response space? I guess you mentioned there's this kind of, low tech pen and paper type approach. How is Voltus kind of originally different?
In 2 big ways. The first way is that we wanted to be able to provide these resources across all markets. Lots of people had entered PJM in a manual way. We wanted to enter not just PJM, but each of the other 8 wholesale markets in North America. That hadn't been done before. No one had entered the Southwest Power Pool. No one had entered MISO, which is the second largest electric grid in North America. And so we actually started there. We started in Peoria, Illinois, to bring resources to MISO for the first time. So that was one big way. And the second way was being able to integrate with and automate lots and lots and lots of types of loads, so that the types of loads we support and bring into these markets is very different than what was done 10 years ago. We can support smaller loads via integrating with a building automation system. We can support residential loads through integrating with partners who manufacture smart thermostats, for example.
And so I suppose in practice, let's say I'm managing a kind of a commercial building and I've signed up for Voltus. What is that kind of, I suppose, process like, and what are the benefits to me as that building owner or building operator?
The benefit to you is cash. That's an easy question to answer. We are paying our customers for the right to help them reduce their electricity consumption a certain number of times per year. The process is we understand what assets that commercial real estate owner has that will allow us to affect its consumption of electricity. And by learning about that building, we can say, aha, here's how we'll monetize it. So we may go to Manhattan, and in one building, they have the ability to reduce their energy consumption for several hours at a time. great. Then we can monetize that in a certain program in New York City. The building across the street doesn't have the ability to reduce consumption for hours at a time, but can reduce energy consumption very quickly, dozens of times a year. Great, we'll monetize that in a different way. So we learn about the building's capabilities, and then we say, how do we optimize the amount of money that the customer can earn by taking a certain action? And then we put those practices into place.
And so the money then for you, that comes from basically these kind of wholesale traded energy markets of various types. Who are the other players in those markets?
So yes, that's correct. And the other players in those markets, we compete sometimes with other curtailment services providers. So Enel X, C-Power. Sometimes there are regional players. Texas has regional players. California has regional players. Those are our main competitors.
And so you mentioned a little bit earlier that 10, 15 years ago, there were actually more limited ways to monetize these types of resources. I guess what changed? Like, was it regulation? Was it the tech has improved? Combination, something else?
Tech has definitely improved. We're able to serve smaller loads than we were a dozen years ago. Regulation has changed dramatically. And that's been a big theme throughout my career, is that there's always lots and lots of money to be made in advance of or right on the heels of regulatory changes. And so part of these, FERC certainly has been involved in helping accelerate the ability of companies like ours to participate in wholesale markets, to bring demand-side resources to wholesale markets and have those resources be paid similar to how supply-side resources are paid. That was a big regulatory change. FERC recently issued an order that we call 2x4, FERC 2222, which is almost a final barrier to unlock distributed energy resources. It'll allow DERs of all types to participate in all wholesale markets. And that's going to unleash the resources we need in order to fully transition the electric grid to renewable energy, to create the electric grid we want, which again is decarbonized, resilient, and cost effective.
Yeah, FERC is this kind of fascinating organization, which I just kind of got to know in the last few months, kind of Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I actually reached out to a few of their economists who worked on 2222, and I managed to get one of them on the phone. And I straight up was like, what are the kind of opportunities for startups in the space? What are the opportunities? Like, basically, what do you want to see happen? And what he said to me was, we have obviously goals, like we want to completely have these things open up in ways that 1,000 new companies are started. But he also was like, it may well just be that it's a kind of a nationalized version of what's happening in California. Like, some states that are already kind of moved along to these kind of more, giving the DERs a little bit more access to wholesale markets. I guess when and I guess the book has yet to be written, but how do you think, just because the regulation, I guess, has started to move in that direction, how it's actually executed across these regions, I guess, is still an open question. So how are you thinking about that?
One of the statistics that we pay a lot of attention to is the fact that most electric grids in the United States haven't seen load growth for a very long time. But if you look at projections, we expect to add about 40% to the total demand of this country over the next 30 years. And there's 4 big drivers of that. It's electric vehicles, number 1. It's the electrification of the home, number 2, as heralded by organizations such as Rewiring America. It's vertical farms, number 3, and then it's data centers connected to everything from Google to Bitcoin. And so when you consider what everyone expects to be a huge growth for demand of electricity, we've got to figure out how to get supply to match that demand. The combined capacity from all lithium-ion batteries that will exist in electric vehicles by the year 2030 is forecast, even by the most conservative forecasts for EV penetration, to be 2 times that of existing power plants currently in the United States. So take every nuclear plant, every gas plant, every coal plant, every central power plant, multiply that by 2, and that's the estimate for the combined capacity of batteries driving around electric vehicles. You have to figure out then How do we use these EVs to help be a supply resource to the grid? It's going to be a huge challenge. Everyone talks about the energy transition. It will not be smooth all the time. There will certainly be bumps in this energy transition.
No, that's fascinating. I guess one of the aspects of the energy system, which I'm only really getting a sense of in the last little while, is this kind of big gap that sometimes called the duck curve between net load in the middle of the day when there's a ton of solar and a reasonable amount of wind, and then kind of late afternoon, early evening when everybody goes home, turns on their air conditioners and so on, and the sun isn't shining in the evening and definitely not shining at night, and so you have this massive kind of drop off, and so that drop off, I guess, to the listener is the reason why we have to keep dirty gas and coal power stations longer than we would like, right? Because we're building a ton of solar, but the solar doesn't replace the type of energy we need at that point. And batteries, I guess, are this kind of fascinating potential alternative. But you have, I guess, two directions you could go with lithium-ion batteries. You could have what they call utility scale, where you're building kind of shipping containers worth of batteries in the desert somewhere. And that's your kind of way to balance the grid at that time of the day, or the EVs, which you mentioned. And I guess if you think about EVs, there's certain parts of the country that's still figuring out even to allow what they call EV to grid. Is it even going to be allowed? How do you think about like that transition? You mentioned it's going to be bumpy, but I guess like what are the first steps you see as kind of emergent as we make that transition?
Reliability has to be job number one. And that's not lost on us. And I think sometimes it's easy to excoriate the coal miners and the coal plants. I think it's helpful instead to understand that our economy and our way of life was built on the backs of those coal miners, and that we have the luxuries we have today because of fossil fuels. And I think it's a really helpful framing. We do need to transition to a fully decarbonized grid. We can't sacrifice reliability to do that. So when we think about how to get there, one thing we look at is Australia. 15 years ago, Australia had a very peaky electrical grid system. And it slowly began to bring on new resources, and it slowly began to decarbonize its grid, and it slowly began to add renewables. And now the problems in Australia are not so much peak demand related, but they're intermittent related. And so they're one step ahead of the United States in terms of integrating renewable resources and figuring out how to not compromise reliability while you do that. And batteries are certainly part of the solution there. Distributed energy resources will be a big, big part of the solution here.
And so one of the other kind of implications of this shift is we have these physical assets out there, batteries you mentioned, or we talked about smart thermostats and all those kind of things, solar plus a battery, like a power wall maybe in the home. And so when you have all these different types of distributed resources, there's different ways you could aggregate them, right, to have these positive effects on the grid and also to make money, of course. And in theory, things like FERC 2222 offers people the chance to make money off these things in new ways. I guess one question I think about in terms of like what the landscape looks like from an innovation point of view is, will there be kind of mom and pop, DER aggregators who can actually engage in the wholesale markets, or are we going to see dozen, Voltus I'm sure is one, but dozen or so kind of fairly large vertically integrated companies who kind of dominate in the space?
Probably the latter, but it'll be fun to see. There are certainly economies of scale, and I think there aren't many barriers to entry, but there are barriers to scale. And so I think that it's likely that there will be a few large winners in the space.
Yeah, I actually agree. And you start with 20 and then some M&A activity, and that's 8, and then we have those 30 years kind of ahead.
You do, part of the benefit of being an aggregator is exactly that. The more resources that you have as an aggregator, the larger the value to the grid from that aggregation. The risk of your portfolio sort of mathematically decreases as you add one more resource. So that lends itself to a few large players winning. But we'll see.
So when you mentioned the barriers for entry are not that high, I guess, again, as an outsider looking in, I've actually talked to a ton of smart software people, typical Silicon Valley type starter. a startup kind of person, and a lot of them looked at clean energy and are like, oh, like there's a lot of opportunity here, and we'll do a deep dive for a month or so, and then a lot will just kind of turn away because once you start digging into all the different regulation in particular, but also some of the kind of challenges we were talked about, it can be quite difficult. And so how do you think about that piece? What are the, I guess, as a general question, like what are the opportunities that smart people either within or outside the industry should be kind of taking advantage of over the next few years?
I think one of the particularities of the energy grid is that there is no standard market design across the wholesale markets that exist in the United States. For example, the rules that pertain to the Texas energy market and how you participate in that market are very different than the rules that pertain to the New England energy market. We call them balkanized, but there's no one standard market design. So for Voltus, our software has to act and look differently depending upon which market we're talking about. That's a real cost to us. And so that is a barrier of entry in a way, because you can't simply build software that works for one sort of code that works everywhere for all programs and for all customers. But it allows for really deep specialization. And I think if I am a software engineer or a company getting off the ground, there is an opportunity to focus on a particular niche and do that niche very, very, very well, and that's going to have value to somebody.
Fascinating. So there's a EV charging, battery management for school buses, right? Something relatively niche that might be something that somebody could tackle. And actually, I think there's a company called Proterra that's doing something similar.
I think that's a good example.
Excellent. And I believe you had a reasonably large raise earlier in the year, and that I guess always, whenever I've been involved in those kind of processes, it always like that very much kind of concentrates the mind on like the kind of near future and the kind of medium term milestones. How are you thinking about like the next steps for Voltus?
We spent the first 5 years really building the foundation. And that means a couple of things. It means creating a product advantage. So we say internally that it's technology to make your life easier, but there are very concrete ways in which our technology helps our customers do things they couldn't do before and can't do with others. And the second foundational piece to us was existing in each and every market, so that when we approach a national account, we are the ones who can serve them across North America. That foundation is now set. And so now it's about really pouring fuel on the fire. And so much of our raise is dedicated to growing the go-to-market team and allowing us to bring on many, many more customers than we have currently in an effort to scale. So we're looking forward to that. It's a huge part of what we're doing. The second part of what we're doing is accelerating our product roadmap with regard to international efforts.
On that kind of secondary piece, in the same way that the US has a dozen different ways or more of selling and buying electricity, depending on where you are. I'm from Ireland originally. Ireland has a very different structure to the United Kingdom, which has a different one to France, and so on around the world. How are you thinking about that internationalization piece? And I guess what have you learned from the navigating so many different jurisdictions in the US that kind of gives a insight into how to expand internationally?
It's a good question. It's not entering a place like Ireland or the UK or Japan or Korea or South Africa isn't that different than how we think about entering Ontario or California. There may be a language difference, obviously, but the market works differently. In fact, the market in Japan may resemble Texas more closely than the market in California resembles Texas. So in some ways, we're very prepared to enter these markets because we're used to them being different. I think that with international expansion, there's always the question of how do you do it right? Do we acquire local talent to help us grow? Do we replicate the success we had here and move those teams somewhere else to do it all over again? And that answer will probably look different depending upon where we're talking about.
Fascinating. And you mentioned earlier, these kind of the need or the how energy grid itself is going to, I think you said something like 40% over the next decade or so, through the kind of different aspects you mentioned. You mentioned vertical farming, you mentioned some other aspects. And then there's also the ones that you didn't mention, which I also think are more maybe kind of moonshots, but things like direct air capture, carbon sequestration. The cost of that is very much a function of cheap electricity. Things like long duration storage in the form of hydrogen through electrolysis or some other kind of processes are also very dependent on ubiquitous clean electricity. And so I guess, one of the tensions in the energy space is a lot of these things have to get energy to such a level of cheapness to enable these other aspects. And so nearly by definition, that's squeezing margins elsewhere. How do you think about the business model and business case for the need for these, this kind of ubiquitous cheap electricity, but it also potentially squeezing margins for the actual energy managers, aggregators, and producers?
I'm not sure that it affects my business, but it certainly affects the ecosystem writ large. One of the reasons we started Voltus, and one of the reasons we do what we do, is because we can have an impact now. We have in one of our markets 1% of System Peak enrolled in a quick response program where we are called to reduce our energy consumption when thermal power plants trip offline. That has removed the need for 2 peaking power plants in the region. It has helped make the grid cleaner while suppressing prices that are passed on to commercial industrial customers. So it makes the whole region more cost competitive. There's no subsidies involved. There's no need for the cost drivers down. That business exists right now, today. And so that's why we chose Voltus. When we think about the ecosystem, if you look at wind, batteries, solar, all these costs have come down much more than was anticipated 10 years ago. And so there is a sort of a learning curve before you can get to the point where those costs come down, but they are coming down dramatically. There is a reason that 80% of all new capacity in the United States last year was renewable. It has nothing to do with subsidies. It has everything to do with the fact that the economics of wind and solar are better than the economics of thermal generation right now. And so, ultimately, it's going to be, this is an economic driven decision. We're going to get to a 100% renewable energy ecosystem, not because of regulation, but because that's the cost-effective way to build the grid.
Right, and it's really just, is it a 25-year project or 50-year project, right? Regulation can help at the margin, sometimes it will often hinder at the margin. But yeah, I mean, I think we've both seen the same charts where very smart people predicted lithium-ion battery prices or solar battery prices, and they were way off in terms of how much cheaper they got, like by a factor of 10 often.
That's right.
I suppose one of the aspects that kind of underlie this, and you mentioned at the beginning, as kind of very core to the mission of Voltus, is a zero carbon, decarbonized grid. How do you kind of look at that or track that internally? Are you having a sense, you mentioned 2 specific peaker plants, but do you have a sense of you don't have to give specific numbers, but do you have a sense of the amount of carbon that's being saved by Voltus expanding out?
Of course. So that figure is important to our teammates. It's important to our investors whose mandates are to invest in decarbonizing solutions. And increasingly, it's important to our customers who, fact of the matter, have larger ESG goals than they had 10 years ago. So it's a really important metric for us to track for those 3 reasons.
And for you, I suppose personally, you've been in the industry a while. I guess now Voltus and the kind of huge success that Voltus is having. What is the kind of biggest thing you've learned at Voltus that was kind of new to you relative to your kind of previous experience?
I think I've known for a long time that the importance of team and to surround yourself with great people. But I think that message has been hammered home at Voltus more so than anywhere else I've been. We are a more ambitious company today than when we started 5 years ago. And that's not because Greg and I suddenly found drive that we didn't have, but it's because our teammates have delivered, I think, more than we thought we were capable of doing in a short period of time. And they have lifted up the ambitions of the company. They've shown us that we can do more than we were capable of. They act with an urgency in order to solve climate change that's inspiring to everybody. And as we continue to hire and bring people onto the team who feel this way, it becomes a force multiplier. And so I didn't anticipate that happening, but it's probably the most wonderful feeling I've had in business.
Yeah, I really do think that this kind of talent issue is going to become ever harder for just even not dirty, not clean, but just kind of in the middle type industries or companies. People, the best talent want to, wake up feeling very, very proud of what they're doing every day. We all deceive ourselves to a certain extent, right? But very easy if you have like a big number on the dashboard up there with carbon prevented or carbon sucked out of the atmosphere, whatever it may be. I guess have more of a skip to your step kind of going in. And you're more likely to tell your friends who are also potentially very, very talented additions to the team as well.
Absolutely. Most of our folks are hired actually from referrals, and it's easier for us to hire now than it was 2 years ago. Partly that's because of the network effect. So each of our teammates now has a network that they can call on. Part of it's due to the fact that we're having some success, but most of it is due to the fact that increasingly everyone, and maybe it's this pandemic, but everyone wants to feel a great connection to their work. Everyone wants to have great purpose. So we're seeing a lot of flight from traditional tech companies into Voltus. And we would have had a hard time attracting that talent just even a couple of years ago.
And it's fascinating, even when I talk to people at the FANG and like the big tech companies, those tech companies are now starting to have climate-related perks to try to keep those people. And they're potentially installing smart thermostats at their employees' homes in a way which is also like a net positive for the likes of Voltus.
I would tell those people there's a more direct way to work on that.
No, absolutely. And let's say I was a young person. I'm 20-year-old. Maybe I went to college, maybe I didn't, and I'm wanting to have a big effect. What kind of advice would you give that person to try to get involved in the kind of climate in a positive way?
A couple of things come to mind. Jump in however you can and develop some deep subject matter expertise. I think because there are so many niches, it's easy in a sense, or it's possible in a sense through hard work to develop skills and know-how that aren't common.
Yeah, I definitely can echo that. I think especially when we have so many emergent new industries, right? And so EV charging infrastructure, there's not too many, maybe there's a couple thousand, single digits thousands experts on that in the world today. There'll be 100,000 of those, right, in the next 5 to 10 years. But you could kind of be top 10% of the world person just by dint of there's not that many people pretty quickly in some of these spaces. And so there was a friend of mine came up with this idea of, climate Mad Libs, come up with a emergent industry, like a region of the world and a basic concept of making money and just like read a ton, talk to a ton of people. And in 6 months, you're kind of a world expert. Now, not in everything, but in a lot of these areas, there is that potential.
I subscribe to that thinking very much so. Traditionally, the way of hiring is, who has done this job before and has the person demonstrated the ability to do the job? We don't hire that way at all. We hire for potential, partly because we're in an industry that hasn't existed before. So no one has had this expertise. No one has actually done this job before. And so we don't look for experience doing the job. We look for what we call bright, gritty, and good. And there are sub-bullets that underpin those words. But it's not experience that is going to move the needle here.
So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that phrase. What are the kind of some of those bullet points you look out for?
We look for people who are nimble, and creative. We look for people with intellectual curiosity. I think when I think about our engineering team, I've been on very talented engineering teams, but this one is different because our engineering team, they see the forest for the trees. They understand how what they do contributes to why we win. They're connected to our mission, very much so. And that's due to their intellectual curiosity to understand the space, to understand our position in that space, again, to understand how we win. We look for folks who are maniacally self-initiated. We look for people who like to win as a team, who are supportive, who are loving, in an effort to, at the end of the day, create an atmosphere that allows people to do their best work.
No, absolutely. And I think those are just phenomenal ways to kind of build a team. The best teams are those greater than some of their parts, where everybody is not just kind of pulling together, but like they feel great, right? And I guess one thing that I think a lot about when I've managed teams that like I've been incredibly proud of, like just they're surprising you every day, right? They're just bringing something. It's like, oh, I would have done it something way different, but what they bring to you is like way better than what you ever could have come up with yourself.
So I think that's the absolute best part about being a founder, because in the early days, right, going back to the early days where you asked me about, you had a say in every single decision, the color of your logo to what market you entered, right? There was nothing that escaped you. And then over time, you sort of seed some things. And then when you start to have some success, there are things that happen that you had absolutely nothing to do with. And that's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely will echo that. Matt, this has been really great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I suppose before we finish up, is there anything I should have asked you about but did not?
We didn't talk. I'll say two things. The first is that we do feel an increased urgency to act, partly because of real-world events like the wildfires in California, like increased hurricanes, like what happens in New Orleans. And so that makes us want to move very, very quickly to solve some of these things. What else is happening is that we have bipartisan support to actually act and do things. That's rare. We have corporations with ESG goals who also are thinking about their company's resilience. And so we have right now an incredible amount of tailwind. That isn't always the case in business. In fact, you're often swimming upstream. But when the opposite happens, which is happening right now, that's when you have to go. You got to pour fuel on the fire. You have to take advantage of that. And so that's what we're looking to do at Voltus. In connection with that, we are hiring across all functions. And so we certainly would love people who are committed to our cause to join us.
And we'll include your careers page in the show notes. And absolutely, I think that's phenomenal. Kind of, I think like this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and obviously like a massive problem that like we all have to pull together to solve. But the opportunity level, it's like it's $1 trillion opportunity to solve across all the different parts of the industry, across all the different parts of society, because climate affects everything. And so, yeah, I guess I'm always encouraging people. I'm always evangelizing with people, get involved in some way, as you've kind of said yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt.
James, thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or the Google Play Store. I cannot express how appreciated it is, and we'll be back next week with another episode.